Welcome! In this series of videos, we will cover the design and implementation of a project, from initial design through coding and development to testing, using the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will continue our project to look at the use of software AutoForms. In the previous videos, we had created a generic application called AutoForm. The purpose of this application was to allow the configuration of a form to exist outside the PowerBasic application. The configuration being held in a CSV file, for example this test demo file. This file has in it an entry for each of the objects that's going to be appearing on screen. For example, the title object is the title of the dialog. Each of the objects on the screen is designated with a line of data, telling the text on the form, the location on the dialog, and the size of the control, followed by its control number and other configuration information. However, while this works very well, we still don't have a mechanism by which a user can actually run the form without having PowerBasic installed. The AutoForm application takes as a parameter the name of the configuration file to load up. What we're going to do today is to create a form runner application. This is an application that when run will interrogate to see how many configuration files are available. It will then display a list box on screen listing all those files. This will allow the user to select one of the forms to load. The form runner application will then run the AutoForms application with the name of that form as a parameter. So in order to do this, I've moved the AutoForm application plus the data and the configs folder inside a forms folder. And in the folder above, we're going to create our formRunner.exe. The layout of this form runner application is going to be in the form of a single dialog. This will display a list to the user listing all the forms found on that folder. The user can then select one of these forms and click the Run Form button. We're doing this with a list box. The list box is set for single select, so the user can only select one form at a time. It's also set to sort the data into alphabetical order. So now that we've created this dialog, let's go in and have a look at the code and see where we need to put our configuration in. So here is the form runner application. I've created three constants at the beginning of the application. A constant for the form folder name, the configuration folder name, and the name of the app we're going to launch, in this case the AutoForm.exe. This allows you to configure this at the beginning of your application so that should you wish to change the name of any of these folders or executables, it's easy to do. So in order to load up our forms, we first need to interrogate the system to see which forms are available. And we'll perform that function inside the event handler, the callback function. We need a function whose job it will be to populate that list box. So we will create a new function called populateList. It's going to have two parameters, the first being the handle of the dialog and the second the handle of the list box. So here is the skeleton of the populateList function, taking its two parameters, the dialog handle and the control handle. As we don't know at runtime just how many forms will be available, we're going to use an array, the str forms array. This will hold the name of each of the CSV files, which is our configuration. So our task within this function is to get that title of the available forms to display to the user. So I'm going to perform that task in a sub-function called getFormsList, passing the pointer to the forms array. We'll create that function in a moment, but let's assume that function has returned a populated array. So now we need to populate our list box with the data, and this can be done quite easily with a for next loop. So our for next loop is going to go between 1 and the upper bounding the size of our forms array. And for each one of these, we're going to add to the list box using the listbox add command. By simply using the listbox add, followed by 3 parameters: the dialog handle, the listbox handle itself, and the element in our array. So now that we've completed that, let's create the subfunction, the getFormsList. And here is the skeleton for that function, passing by reference the forms array. This string array is now going to be populated with the name of each of our configuration files, plus the title of the form so the user knows which form they're clicking on. So our first task is to work out which folder we need to interrogate. So as our form runner is running here, we have a forms folder underneath and a config folder underneath that. And this is the folder that's going to contain all our CSV files. In order to have more than one entry on our list, let's duplicate the test demo CSV file. And we'll call that test demo 2. And we're going to edit that file so that the title is something other than first form. So we'll call it second form and we'll save that. So now that we know which folder to look into, all we need to do is to populate this array. So we'll create a local variable to contain the path to our configs folder. We first need to redimension the array, but as we don't know how many files we're going to be looking for, we'll start with a value of 100 elements. Should we discover there are any more than 100, we can redimension the array again later on in the code. Next, we're going to use the $$ command to look to see which CSV files exist within our folder. This will interrogate the folder and bring back the first file that matches a CSV extension. Next, we want to do a loop to see if there are any more files. So we're going to use the while command. And we're going to use a variable called count to keep track of how many files we've actually discovered. So if we get this far in the code, we've discovered at least one file. So incrementing along count will give you the value of one file. Now that we've found a file, we need to open that file and interrogate it. So we're going to use another variable called longFile to pick up the next available free file number. Our next task will be to open that file to do an interrogation. As there's always a possibility that something else is reading that file, we're going to encapsulate this attempt to read in a try-catch block, just in case an error occurs. If the file is opened successfully, we can move on to the next line of code. Should the file actually be unable to open for some reason, then we can catch the error in here. If our file does open successfully, the first thing to do is to check to see whether the count variable is bigger than the maximum size of the elements within our forms array. If that's the case, we need to increase the size of our array. If you need to increase the size of an array and preserve the information in it, you need to use redim preserve. Increasing an array by one element at a time is a fairly inefficient way of actually doing it. So here we're increasing it by at least 100 elements. This way it minimizes the number of times the array needs to be redimensioned. Now that we've done that, we can actually read the first line into a variable. As you'll remember, in this file we have a number of data lines. The data line we're specifically looking for is the one marked title in the object column, and we're wanting to pick up the text from the text column to say what the name of the form is. This will be displayed to the user in the list box. So first of all, we will take the entire first line and put it into the str field variable. While we can make an assumption that the title row should be the very first row in the file, this may not be necessarily the case in later iterations of the program. So we're going to loop through each of the rows in this configuration file until we find the title line. or until we've read the very last line in the file. We can do this in a do loop, using the until command to ensure that the loop will continue until these conditions are met. The condition we're using is a parse command to look for the title word in the very first column, or we're looking for the end of file marker to be true, in which case we've reached the end of the file. So we will execute the line input to pull the value into the str field variable. And if that happens to be equal to the word title, then we will drop out of the loop. We now have to test to see, are we at the end of the file, or have we actually found what we're looking for? So if the end of file is false, then we must have got the title line, in which case we can now store the title line and the name of the form in our array. So we're doing this quite simply by using the long count to point to the element of the array we need to populate. We're using the parse command to pull back the second column. This is the title of the form, and we're adding on to that, in brackets, the name of the file we're interrogating. This gives us a mechanism to record the name of the configuration file, which we'll need later. In the finally section of the try-catch block, we can close the file down. This is the last thing it does. And having read that file, we now have to go on and read the next one. So we need to use the dir command again to pick up the next available file name. So when we drop out of the while loop, we will have an array which has been populated with all the files we've been able to find. However, the array is very likely to be larger than the amount of data contained within it. As we dimensioned the array with 100 elements, if there are exactly 100 files found, then that would be fine, but it's likely that we'll probably have less. So we need to truncate the array just down to the amount of data items we've actually found. Since the count variable is actually counting, we can use that to redim and preserve the data. So if the count variable is greater than 0, we're redimming, preserving the array from 1 to the number of elements we've found, the count variable. We can then return the function to be true. Else the function will return false because we found no files at all in the config folder. So let's try running the application now to see if it finds the two config files we expect it to see. And there on our list box are the two files, the first form and the second form, with the name of their files. Next, we need to put the functionality under the Run Form button. This will pick up whichever form has been selected by the user and will attempt to run the AutoForm application with the name of that file as a parameter. So let's look back at our callback function to see how we can set that up. In the callback function, there's a section which handles the mouse clicks on the Run Form button. So first we need to get the text that has been selected, if anything. We can do that by doing the listbox getText command, passing it two parameters, the handle of the dialog, the handle of the control, and a variable into which we want to put the text. If that variable comes back with an empty len string, then nothing has been selected. So we can test for that. So if the form variable has been populated and it's not an empty len string, we can now select from that string the name of the CSV file in brackets, using the parse command. Using the any option in the parse command gives you the option of having more than one delimiter. So we're using the any command within parse to look for either of these two delimiters, the open bracket or the close bracket. This will give us the data that's within the two brackets, the name of the config file to load. Having got that information, we can now run AutoForm. We can do that quite easily using the shell command. We're shelling out to the form application. And we're passing a parameter of the configs folder plus the name of the form to launch. So let's try running our application now and see how it works. We have the two forms on the dialog. If we pick the first form and hit the Run Form button, it will launch our first form. If we exit from that, if we select the second form and hit the Run Form button, it will launch the second form. So what we've achieved today is we have created a form running application, which will basically front-end the AutoForms application. This allows you to display to a user a selection of forms which they can run. And all the user needs to do is to pick the form from the screen, hit the Run Form button, and the form will appear. Once they're finished with that form, they can exit that and pick a different form or just exit from the form runner. In our next video, we'll do more configuration of AutoForm to add more controls. However, that's it for today. Thank you for watching.